Humans are dormant war gods. Part 1. The galaxy had always thought humans were weak. They were traders and farmers who spent their time moving goods between star systems. Their ships were slow and built for cargo, not fighting. Their military was small, with maybe 100 warships protecting 50 colonies. Every other species had more guns, bigger fleets, and longer histories of conquest. Humans were new to space, barely 300 years off their home planet, and they seemed content to stay peaceful. Jake Morrison had been a ship captain for 20 years. He commanded a transport vessel called Horizon's Edge, hauling food and minerals between human colonies and alien trade ports. His crew of 30 people knew their jobs well. They loaded cargo, calculated jump routes, and made sure the engines didn't explode. It was boring work most days, but Jake liked boring. He had seen enough excitement in his younger years. That morning started like any other. Jake was reviewing shipping manifests in his quarters when the emergency channel crackled to life. The voice that came through was broken by static, but the terror in it was clear enough. It was a distress call from New Dakota, a farming colony 6 hours away. The speaker was screaming about ships in orbit and fires burning across the settlements. Then the transmission cut off completely. Jake ran to the bridge. His pilot, Lisa Grant, was already pulling up the navigation charts. Her hands were shaking as she plotted a course to New Dakota. The nearest military ship was 3 days out. The Horizon's Edge could be there in 6 hours, but they were not equipped for combat. They had one small plasma cannon meant for clearing space debris and basic shields that could barely handle a meteor strike. Lisa looked at Jake with wide eyes. She wanted him to tell her they should wait for the military, that there was nothing a cargo ship could do. But Jake was already strapping into the captain's chair and ordering the jump to New Dakota. When they arrived, Jake wished they had not come. The planet was burning. Massive alien warships hung in orbit, their weapons still glowing from bombardment. These were Krevlon ships marked with the red symbols of their empire. The Krevlon were one of the most powerful species in the galaxy. They had conquered 17 other races over the past 1,000 years. Now they were attacking humans. The surface of New Dakota was covered in fires. Farms were destroyed. Entire towns had been reduced to smoking craters. Thousands of escape pods floated in space around the planet, filled with survivors who had nowhere to go. As Jake watched, a Krevlon fighter shot one of the pods just for entertainment. The pod exploded, killing everyone inside. Something changed in Jake at that moment. It felt like a door opening in his mind, or maybe a lock breaking off a cage. His hands stopped shaking. His breathing became steady and calm. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made his entire crew turn to stare at him. He told Lisa to turn the ship toward the Krevlon destroyer. She started to argue, but the look on his face stopped her. The Horizon's Edge came about and faced the enemy warship. It should have been suicide. The destroyer was 50 times their size and had enough weapons to vaporize them in seconds. But Jake's fingers were already moving across the weapons console, and he was seeing things he had never noticed before. He could see patterns in the enemy shields, tiny moments when they cycled between frequencies. Jake fired their single plasma cannon 4 times. Each shot hit at the exact microsecond when the shields were weakest. The 4th shot punched through and struck the destroyer's engine. The massive Krevlon ship lurched sideways, smoke pouring from the damaged section. The Krevlon returned fire with everything they had. Plasma bolts and missiles filled the space around the Horizon's Edge. Jake's hands flew across the controls, angling their shields and diverting power from non-essential systems. He was making calculations he had never studied, seeing angles and trajectories that should have been impossible to predict. The ship twisted and turned through the incoming fire like a dancer. His engineer, Carl Hayes, was doing things to the engines that violated every safety protocol. He was squeezing more power from the reactors than they were ever designed to produce. The ship should have been tearing itself apart, but somehow it held together. Every member of the crew was moving with impossible precision, as if they had been training for this moment their entire lives. For 12 minutes, the cargo ship fought the destroyer. Jake found an opening when the Krevlon put too much power into their forward guns. Their reactor shielding became vulnerable for just a moment. He fired their last plasma charge directly into that weak point. The destroyer's reactor went critical. The explosion was so bright it lit up the dark side of the planet like a second sun. 3,000 Krevlon warriors died in that blast. In the silence that followed, Jake looked at his hands. They were not shaking. His heart was beating normally. He had just killed thousands of beings, and all he felt was a quiet satisfaction that it had been done efficiently. Something was very wrong with that, but he could not bring himself to care. He ordered his crew to recover all the escape pods. As the survivors came aboard, they told stories of the attack. The Krevlon had arrived without warning and declared that human colonies were now property of their empire. They said humans were weak and did not deserve the space they claimed. Similar attacks were happening on a dozen other human worlds right now. Jake listened and felt that door in his mind open even wider. The survivors had the same look in their eyes that he saw in his crew. Something ancient was waking up inside all of them, something that had been sleeping for 300 years of peace. Humans had been peaceful because they chose to be, not because they did not know how to fight. Their ancestors had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of war before they finally achieved peace. Every battle, every weapon, every tactical innovation was stored in human history and maybe in their genes. 3 centuries of peace had buried those instincts deep, but they had not erased them. The galaxy had made a terrible mistake. They had attacked human civilians. They had assumed that peaceful meant weak. They were about to learn the difference between choosing not to fight and not knowing how to fight. Jake set course for the nearest human military base. He needed to report what had happened, but he also needed to warn them. Something was waking up in humanity, and once it was fully awake, the galaxy was going to see what humans had been before they became peaceful. The dormant war gods were stirring, and when they opened their eyes completely, the universe would never see humans the same way again. Humans are dormant war gods. Part 2. The news spread through human space faster than anyone expected. A cargo ship had destroyed a Krevlon destroyer. Within hours, more reports flooded in from other colonies. A mining crew with no military training had captured an enemy supply depot. A group of farmers with hunting rifles had held off an entire battalion of Krevlon soldiers for 3 days. Something impossible was happening to humans across all the colonies. The Galactic Council called an emergency meeting. Helen Wright had been humanity's ambassador for 15 years. She was known for her diplomatic skills and her ability to find peaceful solutions to conflicts. The council respected her because she represented a species that never caused trouble. That was about to change. The Krevlon ambassador was a huge creature named Thakkor. He stood before the council and dismissed the human concerns with a wave of his massive hand. He said the attacks on human colonies were legitimate expansion into territories that humans could not properly defend. His tone suggested this was already over and done with. Helen stood up slowly. Every ambassador in the chamber turned to look at her. There was something different about her posture, something in her eyes that had not been there before. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried across the entire chamber. She told them that the Krevlon had made a grave error. They had attacked human civilians and children. The Krevlon ambassador laughed and asked what humanity would do about it. Did they plan to send their merchant fleet against the Krevlon armada? Helen's expression did not change. She said she was recommending to Earth that they authorize something called Protocol Phoenix. None of the aliens knew what that meant. They would learn soon enough. On Earth, President Daniel Cross received the ambassador's message in his office in Geneva. He sat in silence for a long time, then called in his military advisors. He told them to bring every historian they could find. What followed was something that had never happened in galactic history. Humanity did not mobilize their military in the traditional way. Instead, they opened their archives. For 300 years, humans had focused on peace, art, science, and exploration. But before those 3 centuries, there had been 10,000 years of something else. Humanity had been warriors. Not just soldiers, but masters of warfare in every form imaginable. The archives contained everything: battle strategies from ancient empires, tactical manuals from every major war in human history, the works of Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, and countless other military theorists. Every weapon ever designed, every formation ever used, every trick and tactic that had been developed over millennia, of humans fighting other humans. But there was more than just knowledge in those archives. Dr. Lisa Kemp had discovered something 5 years earlier while researching how humans responded to stress. She found that humans carried dormant combat instincts buried deep in their genetic code. These instincts came from millions of years of being predators on their home planet. During peacetime, they stayed dormant, but under the right circumstances, with the right trigger, they could wake up. The attacks on human colonies were the trigger. Jake Morrison and his crew had not suddenly learned new skills. They had remembered old ones. Skills that had been passed down through countless generations and stored in human DNA. Protocol Phoenix was simple. Stop suppressing those old instincts. Let humanity remember what it used to be. Within 1 week, the transformation was visible everywhere. Human civilians across the frontier colonies organized themselves into defensive militias. They built fortifications using principles that had not been taught in 3 centuries. They created supply lines and communication networks that would have taken other species months to establish. It was all happening instinctively, as if every human had been born knowing how to do this. Lieutenant Alex Murphy was a career officer in Earth's small defense fleet. He had studied military tactics in school and trained for years to reach his position. But suddenly, he understood strategy at a level that went beyond anything he had been taught. When he looked at star charts, he saw choke points and supply routes. When he studied enemy fleet compositions, he saw weaknesses and opportunities. It was not like learning. It was like remembering something he had always known. His ship was a small corvette called the Defiant. Command ordered him to defend a colony called New Arizona. Intelligence reports said a Krevlon strike force of 20 ships was heading their way. The Defiant was alone and reinforcements were 2 days out. Alex was supposed to do what he could and then retreat before his ship was destroyed. Alex had no intention of retreating. He took the Defiant into the asteroid belt between New Arizona and the incoming enemy fleet. Using mining drones and spare parts from the colony, his crew created something that looked like a minefield. But it was not a traditional minefield. The explosives were timed and positioned to create a cascade effect, where each explosion would push asteroids into carefully calculated paths. When the Krevlon fleet arrived, their sensors detected the mines. They adjusted course to avoid them, which was exactly what Alex wanted. He had positioned the minefield to funnel the enemy ships into a narrow corridor. In that corridor, their numbers would work against them. Their shields would interfere with each other, and they would not have room to maneuver properly. The Defiant waited at the far end of the corridor. When the Krevlon ships entered the kill zone, Alex triggered the mines. Massive asteroids began tumbling through the enemy formation. The Krevlon tried to dodge, but the corridor was too narrow. Ships collided with each other. Their shields created cascade failures when they overlapped. The formation fell apart. The Defiant picked them off one by one. 20 Krevlon warships were destroyed by a single human corvette. When it was over, Alex sat in his command chair and realized he had just recreated an ancient battle called Thermopylae, adapted for 3-dimensional space combat. He had never studied that battle in detail, but somehow he had known exactly how to use the same principles. The old ways were returning to every human in space. Soldiers were remembering tactics they had never been taught. Engineers were designing weapons based on principles from ancient history. Strategists were planning campaigns that combined modern technology with warfare concepts that were thousands of years old. The Krevlon Empire had expected to conquer humanity in a few weeks. They had superior numbers, better ships, and warriors bred specifically for combat. They had conquered 17 other species using these advantages. But they had never fought a species like humanity before. Other species learned warfare from their own history. Humans learned warfare from fighting each other for 10,000 years. They had developed tactics for every terrain, every situation, every possible variation of combat. They had fought wars in deserts, jungles, mountains, oceans, and frozen wastelands. They had used clubs, swords, arrows, guns, tanks, aircraft, and nuclear weapons. Every lesson from all of that experience was waking up inside every human alive. The galaxy was starting to realize what humanity really was. They were not peaceful because they did not understand war. They were peaceful because they understood war better than anyone else. They knew exactly how terrible it could be. They had chosen to leave it behind, but now the choice had been taken away from them. The dormant war gods were awake, and they were remembering why they had once conquered an entire planet. Humans are dormant war gods. Part 3, the Krevlon Empire had conquered 17 species over 1,000 years. They knew how to wage war. Their fleets numbered in the thousands. Their warriors were bred for combat, and their weapons could crack planets open. When reports of defeats against humans reached their military council, they dismissed them as luck and coincidence. Real war was about to begin. Admiral Krevtok commanded the Third Fleet, which consisted of 200 warships. These were veterans who had fought in dozens of campaigns across the galaxy. He received orders to crush the human infestation once and for all. His target was Earth itself, the human homeworld. Destroy Earth and the rest of humanity would fall apart. He called his officers together and laid out the situation. Humans had 80 military vessels total. The Third Fleet had 200 ships, all of them larger and more powerful. Humans had 3 centuries of peace. The Krevlon had a millennium of continuous warfare. This would be over quickly. The Third Fleet jumped into the Sol system expecting to find Earth defended by its small navy, and maybe some civilian ships pressed into emergency service. What they found instead made Admiral Krevtok stop cold. Earth was surrounded by thousands of ships. Not military vessels. Civilian ships. Freighters, mining barges, passenger liners, research vessels, even small personal craft. Every ship that had been in or near the Sol system had been armed with whatever weapons could be mounted in 72 hours. Railguns were welded to cargo haulers. Missile pods were attached to passenger ships. Mining lasers had been redirected for combat use. It should have been laughable, a makeshift fleet of civilian vessels against the might of the Third Fleet. But as Admiral Krevtok's tactical officer analyzed the formation, his confidence began to fade. The humans were positioned in a 3-dimensional defensive sphere with overlapping fields of fire. Each ship protected its neighbors. The formation took advantage of Earth's orbital satellites, the moon's gravity well, and even the solar wind from the sun. Every environmental factor had been turned into a weapon. Captain Nicole Baker commanded one of those civilian ships. The Morning Star had been a medical transport 2 days ago. Now it was the forward element of Earth's defense, armed with improvised weapons and carrying a crew of 30 civilians. None of them had military training. None of them should have known what they were doing. Her sensor operator reported that the Third Fleet was moving in. 200 ships confirmed. Nicole felt no fear. That door in her mind was wide open now. She could see the battle before it happened, could predict enemy movements based on principles older than spaceflight. She ordered all ships to hold position and wait for her signal. The Krevlon fleet advanced. They opened fire at maximum range, a standard tactic meant to overwhelm defenses through sheer volume of fire. Thousands of plasma bolts and missiles streaked toward Earth's makeshift fleet. It looked like a wall of death that nothing could survive. Nicole waited. She counted seconds in her head, watching the incoming fire spread out. Then she gave the order. Every ship in the human fleet moved as one. They rotated to present angled armor. Cargo containers were jettisoned into the path of incoming fire, serving as crude chaff that disrupted missile guidance systems. The formation compressed and shifted, creating gaps that pulled Krevlon fire away from critical targets. 70% of the incoming fire missed completely. The remaining 30% was absorbed by shields and armor. Only 3 civilian ships were destroyed in the initial exchange. Nicole gave the order to return fire. The human fleet unleashed everything they had. The weapons were crude by military standards, but the targeting was not. Every shot was placed with surgical precision, hitting weak points in shields and targeting sensor arrays. The sheer volume of fire was overwhelming. 6 Krevlon ships were destroyed in the first minute of combat. 12 more were crippled and drifting. Admiral Krevtok stared at his tactical displays in disbelief. His crew was reporting casualties that should not have been possible. These were civilians in converted cargo ships. They should have been annihilated in the first exchange. Instead, they were fighting with sophistication that matched or exceeded Krevlon military doctrine. What the Admiral did not understand was that he was not fighting 3 centuries of peaceful humans. He was fighting 10,000 years of accumulated warfare experience. Every crew member on every human ship was channeling instincts refined through countless generations of conflict. They were remembering battles fought with swords and arrows, with rifles and artillery, with tanks and aircraft. All of that knowledge was being applied to space combat. The battle raged for 6 hours. The Third Fleet had superior ships and better weapons. Their warriors had trained their entire lives for combat. But the humans had something the Krevlon could not match. They had desperation born from fighting for their homeworld. They had fury at watching their colonies burn. And they had tactical knowledge accumulated from a species that had spent most of its existence perfecting the art of killing its own kind. The Krevlon used standard fleet tactics. The humans adapted in real time, countering every move with variations and innovations. When the Krevlon tried to concentrate fire on individual human ships, the fleet would shift to protect the targeted vessel. When the Krevlon attempted flanking maneuvers, The humans had already predicted the move and repositioned to counter it. Nicole Baker's Morning Star took heavy damage 3 hours into the fight. Her shields failed and half her weapons were destroyed. A Krevlon cruiser moved in for the kill, but Nicole did not retreat. She pointed her crippled ship directly at the cruiser and accelerated to ramming speed. The Krevlon captain had seen desperate tactics before. He was confident his shields could handle the impact from a damaged transport vessel. What he did not account for was Nicole timing the collision to the exact microsecond when his shields cycled frequencies. The Morning Star smashed through the weak point and tore into the cruiser's hull. Both ships were destroyed. Nicole and her crew of 30 civilians took a Krevlon cruiser with them. It was a trade ratio that should have favored the Krevlon, but it happened again and again throughout the battle. Humans were willing to sacrifice themselves if it meant taking enemies with them. When the Third Fleet finally retreated, 60 of its 200 ships were destroyed. Another 40 were too damaged to continue fighting. Earth's civilian fleet had lost 40 ships, but thousands of survivors had been rescued from the wrecks. By every conventional military calculation, the humans should have been annihilated. On the Krevlon flagship, Admiral Krevtok composed his report to the Empire. His hands trembled as he wrote. He reported that the humans were not what they appeared. Their civilians fought like elite warriors. Their improvised tactics surpassed formal military doctrine. Most disturbing of all, they were getting better with every engagement, as if they were remembering something long forgotten. He concluded with a recommendation that shocked the Krevlon High Command. He advised negotiating a ceasefire. The Empire needed to study the humans and understand what they were before attempting another attack. The High Command dismissed his concerns. Admiral Krevtok was declared a coward. The Third Fleet had simply been unlucky. They would send a larger force. The First and Second Fleets would combine for the next assault. 500 ships. Surely that would be enough to crush the humans. They did not understand that the problem was not numbers. The sleeping giant was awake now, and it was remembering how much it had once enjoyed war. Humans are dormant war gods. Part 4, the Galactic Council called another emergency session 6 weeks after the first Krevlon attack. Ambassador Helen Wright stood before representatives of 43 species and presented humanity's demands. Her voice was calm and diplomatic, but there was steel underneath every word. The Krevlon Empire would withdraw from all human territories immediately. They would pay reparations for the colonies they had destroyed. They would surrender the officers who had ordered attacks on civilians. If these demands were not met within 30 days, humanity would consider itself at war with the Krevlon Empire. The Krevlon ambassador Thakkor laughed. It was a sound that echoed through the council chamber. He stood and reminded everyone that the Krevlon had fleets, warriors, and 1,000 years of conquest behind them. Humanity had merchants and farmers pretending to be soldiers. The idea of humans threatening the Empire was absurd. Helen Wright smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. She said again that they had 30 days. Then she left the chamber. The Krevlon Empire refused the demands. They gathered their forces for a massive assault. The First and Second Fleets were combined into a single armada of 500 warships. They would bypass Earth, which had proven troublesome, and strike at the heart of human colonial space. 20 colonies would be hit simultaneously, overwhelming any defense humanity could organize. It was a good strategy. It should have worked. But the Krevlon made one critical mistake. They assumed humanity's transformation was limited to those directly threatened by invasion. They did not understand that Protocol Phoenix had awakened something in every human across all of human space. Greg Foster was the colony administrator for New Montana, a farming world with 12,000 people. When intelligence reports indicated a Krevlon fleet was heading their way, he did not panic. He did not order evacuation. Instead, he called a town meeting. 12,000 civilians gathered in the colony's central hall. They were farmers, teachers, engineers, shop owners, and children. None of them were soldiers. Greg stood before them and explained the situation plainly. The Krevlon were coming to kill them all. They would arrive in 4 days. The colony had no military ships and no proper weapons. But they had something the Krevlon did not understand. They had the old ways. For 4 days, 12,000 people worked without rest. Orbital farming platforms were converted into weapon emplacements. Mining equipment was modified to serve as artillery. The colony's irrigation systems were turned into a network of fuel air bombs. Children and elderly were evacuated to underground bunkers that doubled as command centers. The main fusion reactor was rigged to overload on command, a last resort that would take any invading force with them. When the Krevlon arrived, New Montana looked peaceful from orbit. They sent landing forces expecting easy conquest. Instead, they walked into a killing ground that had been prepared by people who remembered how to fight. The humans used tactics that were ancient and brutal. They ambushed enemy patrols using terrain advantages. They created choke points where Krevlon numbers meant nothing. They employed psychological warfare, making the enemy hear things in the dark and see movement where there was none. Farmers who had never fired a weapon in anger moved through combat zones like special forces operators. Children ran intelligence networks that impressed even professional spies. For 3 days, 12,000 civilians held off a Krevlon invasion force of 30,000 trained warriors. They did not just hold. They inflicted casualties at a ratio of 5-to-1. Similar stories were playing out across 20 human colonies. Everywhere the Krevlon struck, they found not helpless civilians but awakened warriors. But the real surprise came from humanity's actual military. While the Krevlon had focused their attention on overwhelming colonial defenses, Earth's Navy had been planning something more ambitious. Admiral Kate Ross commanded the human fleet. She had 75 warships at her disposal. The Krevlon had 500. Direct engagement would be suicide. So Admiral Ross decided not to engage directly. She divided her fleet into 15 groups of 5 ships each. These hunter-killer packs spread out across Krevlon space. They did not attack military targets. They attacked logistics. Fuel depots were destroyed in quick raids. Supply convoys were ambushed and left burning. Communication relays were knocked offline. Food production facilities were sabotaged. The Krevlon Empire's vast military machine required vast supply chains to function. Admiral Ross set about systematically destroying those chains. Captain Chris Hayes commanded one of these packs. 5 corvettes against an empire. His specialty was hit-and-run attacks. They would jump into a system, strike a target before defenders could respond, and jump back out. They never hit the same system twice. They never followed a predictable pattern. In 1 month, Chris Hayes and his pack destroyed enough supplies to support 10,000 Krevlon warriors for a year. They lost 1 ship in the process. The mathematics was brutal and simple. If 5 human ships could eliminate resources meant for 10,000 soldiers, then 75 ships could cripple an empire. The Krevlon High Command found themselves facing a problem they had never encountered before. Their armies were winning individual battles against human colonies, but they were losing the war. Their fleets controlled the battle spaces, but they could not protect their supply lines. Their warriors were the finest in the galaxy, but they could not fight without food, fuel, and ammunition. Meanwhile, the humans kept adapting. Every week brought new tactics and strategies. Human commanders studied each engagement and immediately shared lessons learned across the entire fleet. Weapon systems were improved based on combat data. Ship designs were modified to address weaknesses discovered in battle. It was as if humanity had spent 3 centuries studying every mistake an enemy could make and was now exploiting all of them at once. The Krevlon had been fighting wars for 1,000 years using the same basic approach. Overwhelming force applied directly to the enemy. It had worked against 17 other species. But humans had spent 10,000 years fighting other humans, the smartest and most adaptable enemy in their part of the galaxy. They had learned to be creative, to think asymmetrically, to find advantages wherever they could. 6 months into the war, the Krevlon Empire controlled none of the human colonies they had attacked. Their own border worlds were under threat from human raids. Their economy was collapsing as supply chains failed. And humanity had lost fewer ships than they started with because for every vessel destroyed, 3 more were being built using lessons learned from combat. The Galactic Council convened again. This time it was the Krevlon who came asking for negotiations. Ambassador Thakakor stood before Helen Wright, his pride shattered, and formally requested council mediation to end the conflict. Helen Wright listened to his speech. Then she said one word. No, Thakakor was shocked. He explained that both sides had suffered enough, that continued war would only lead to more death, that the council would support a negotiated peace. Helen's expression remained cold. She reminded him that humanity had offered peace 30 days after the first attack. The Krevlon had refused. They had chosen war. Now they would experience what war with humanity truly meant. The attacks would continue until the Krevlon Empire accepted humanity's original demands without modification. Thakor tried one last argument. He said that if humans did not stop now, they would become what the Krevlon were: warriors, conquerors. They would lose what made them special. Helen Wright met his eyes and said they would take that risk. The dormant war gods were fully awake now, and they would not go back to sleep until this was finished. Humans are dormant war gods. Part 5. The war ended not with a grand final battle, but with the slow collapse of Krevlon resistance. After 8 months of conflict, the Empire agreed to a ceasefire. They withdrew from all human territories, paid reparations, and surrendered war criminals for trial. It was the first time in 1,000 years that the mighty Krevlon had been forced to sue for peace. But the real change was not in the treaty terms. It was in humanity itself. Protocol Phoenix could not be reversed. Once the old instincts had been awakened, they did not go back to sleep. Every human now carried the knowledge of war in their active consciousness. 3 centuries of peace had been traded for something darker and more powerful. The question everyone was asking was whether the trade had been worth it. Commander Jake Morrison now commanded a battlecruiser instead of a cargo ship. He was celebrated as a hero across human space. The man who had started everything by destroying a Krevlon destroyer and saving the survivors of New Dakota. Medals hung on his uniform. His name was taught in schools. But when he looked in the mirror, he was not sure he recognized the person staring back. His first officer, Lisa Grant, found him one night staring out at the stars. She asked if he had regrets. Jake thought about the question carefully before answering. He said he had questions instead. Humanity had been peaceful and generally happy. Now they were warriors. Was the trade worth it? Lisa was quiet for a moment. She reminded him that the Krevlon had given them no choice. If humans had remained peaceful, they would have been conquered or exterminated. At least this way they had survived. Jake asked at what cost. It was a question that philosophers and psychologists across human space were trying to answer. Studies were being conducted on the transformation humanity had undergone. What researchers found was both fascinating and disturbing. The old instincts had not just brought back tactical knowledge. They had changed how humans thought about everything, how they perceived threats, how they interacted with other species, how they saw their place in the galaxy. Dr. Lisa Kemp, who had discovered the dormant combat instincts years earlier, published a paper that sent shockwaves through human society. She wrote that humanity had become what it needed to become in order to survive. But now they had to decide whether to stay this way once the immediate threat was gone. Could they put the war gods back to sleep? Should they even try? President Daniel Cross formed a special commission to study the question. Half the members argued for keeping Protocol Phoenix active. Humanity needed to maintain their newfound military strength to protect themselves in a dangerous galaxy. The other half wanted to find a way to return to the peaceful civilization they had been. The debate went on for months with no clear answer. Then the Galactic Council made a decision that changed everything. They invited humanity to join as a full member with all rights and responsibilities. One of those responsibilities was military defense of Council space. The Council had seen what humans could do. They wanted that capability protecting them instead of threatening them. Ambassador Helen Wright received the invitation with mixed feelings. She told President Cross that the Council wanted humanity because they were dangerous now. Fear had earned them respect. Cross asked if that was so different from the respect they had earned through peace. Helen said yes, because fear and respect were not the same thing, but humanity accepted the invitation. They had little choice. Other species were reassessing their relationships with humanity. Some saw opportunities for alliance, others saw potential threats. Remaining isolated was no longer practical or safe. Admiral Kate Ross became the first human appointed to the Galactic Defense Fleet. Her job was to integrate human tactics with traditional Council military doctrine. It proved to be challenging work. Human methods were often brutal, focused on efficiency and victory rather than honor or fighting fair. Other Council species were uncomfortable with some of the tactics humans considered normal. One Council general told Kate that humans fought like predators, not like civilized beings. Kate's response was simple and honest. Humans were predators. They had spent 1,000,000 years at the top of their planet's food chain. 3 centuries of peace had not changed their fundamental nature. It had just made them forget what they were. The galaxy slowly adapted to this new reality. Trade with humanity flourished because no one wanted humans as enemies. Diplomatic relationships became more careful and respectful. The days of dismissing humans as irrelevant newcomers were over. But humanity itself struggled with its new identity. Captain Nicole Baker had returned to merchant work after the war. She had been one of the civilian captains who defended Earth, commanding the Morning Star until it was destroyed, taking a Krevlon cruiser with it. She had survived by ejecting in an escape pod at the last second. Now she was back to hauling cargo between systems. She found peacetime difficult to adjust to. The old routines felt hollow and meaningless now. She had experienced combat and felt the clarity of purpose that came with fighting for survival. Hauling cargo could not compete with that intensity. She was not alone in feeling this way. Across human space, civilians who had fought in the war found peacetime unsatisfying. Veterans groups formed to maintain combat skills. Military service saw unprecedented enrollment. Combat sports became wildly popular. Psychologists had a name for it: warrior syndrome. A species that had awakened to its martial nature now struggled to find purpose in peace. Some experts worried that humanity would become like the Krevlon, seeking conflict to satisfy the instincts they had unleashed. Others believed humans could learn to control these impulses. Commander Alex Murphy, who had defended New Arizona so brilliantly, became an instructor at the New Earth Military Academy. He taught strategy and tactics to young officers. But he also taught history, the full history of human warfare, including its terrible costs. He wanted his students to understand something important. He told them they needed to remember why they fought, not for glory or conquest, but to protect what they cared about. The moment they started fighting for other reasons, they would become no better than the species they had defeated. This philosophy became the core of human military doctrine. They would be warriors, yes, but warriors with purpose and restraint. 5 years after the war ended, Ambassador Helen Wright proposed a new initiative to the Galactic Council. Humanity would provide military training to other species, sharing the tactical knowledge that had proven so effective. In return, those species would teach humans about their own traditions of peace and conflict resolution. Helen explained that humanity was not trying to turn everyone into warriors, but every species should have the ability to defend itself effectively. And every warrior species should understand the value of peace and when fighting was truly necessary. The proposal was accepted after lengthy debate. Human military advisors spread across council space. They taught and they learned. They built relationships that went beyond fear or respect toward genuine understanding. Commander Jake Morrison became one of those advisors. He found himself on a peaceful world, teaching orbital defense tactics to a species that had never fought a war in their recorded history. One evening, a young student asked him if he regretted humanity becoming warriors. The student said humans had seemed happier before the transformation. Jake thought about New Dakota burning. He thought about the choices that had been made and the prices that had been paid. He thought about the thousands of human colonies that still existed because humanity had remembered how to fight. He told the student that humanity had lost something precious. Their innocence, perhaps. Their belief that the galaxy was fundamentally safe and civilized. But they had gained something important too. The knowledge that they could protect themselves, that they did not have to rely on others for their survival. Whether that was a fair trade, he could not say. Ask him again in 100 years. Humanity's transformation was complete. They had evolved from dismissed peaceful merchants to respected warriors in less than a year. But they had also learned something the Krevlon Empire never had. Being capable of war did not mean seeking it out. Strength was most powerful when held in reserve, used only when truly necessary. The dormant war gods had awakened. But they had made a choice, however imperfect and difficult, to be guardians rather than conquerors. The galaxy was still learning to understand humanity. But then, humans were still learning to understand themselves. In the end, maybe that was the most important lesson. No species was just one thing. Humans could be peaceful traders and deadly warriors, artists and soldiers, diplomats and destroyers. The key was knowing when to be which. The old ways had returned to humanity after 3 centuries of sleep, but they had returned to a species that had learned, during those peaceful centuries, why war should always be a last resort rather than a first choice. Whether that wisdom would hold in the centuries to come remained to be seen. But for now, humanity stood as something unique in the galaxy, a bridge between the peaceful species of the Council and the martial empires that threatened them. They were dormant war gods who had awakened. And they were choosing every single day what kind of gods they would be.